Today's speaker is actually at the University of Indiana. It's Dr. Antonina Luszczykiewicz, who is originally on the faculty at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, one of the oldest universities in Europe. And she is the founding director of the Taiwan Lab Research Center, which was just founded a few years ago. And which demonstrates the greater interest in Central Europe on the issue of Taiwan. She is also a non-resident fellow of the Taiwan Center for Security Studies at the National Chengchi University in Taiwan. And it's a particularly important time to explore this subject, and we look forward to hearing your views. Antonina?
Thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today, and I would like to thank the East-West Center for their kind invitation. Greetings from Bloomington, which is today pretty rainy and pretty windy. So my guess is that those who are in Hawaii and Honolulu are a little bit more lucky than myself. However, I'm really privileged to be a Fulbright Senior Scholar at Indiana University in Krakow, and I'm even more happy to share some of my thoughts about the case of Taiwan and Taiwan-US relations just before I head back to Poland after finishing my Fulbright stay at Indiana University. Let me then share my screen with you. The title of my presentation suggests I would like to talk today about the future of Taiwan and the United States in the light of Xi Jinping's third term. However, since we have a very international audience, as Richard has already mentioned, I would like to introduce the Central and Eastern European perspective, not just because I myself come from that region, but as Richard has already highlighted, this is a region which is showing an increasingly big interest in what's going on in the Taiwan Strait, and several countries of that region are actually developing and strengthening relations with Taiwan, even though these are unofficial relations with Taiwan still, this kind of dynamic can be observed. However, first things first, and I would like to start with the most recent events, namely the President Biden State of the Union address, which I had the pleasure to watch here in Bloomington in full. And even though Taiwan was not mentioned, China was mentioned indeed several times. And this is particularly meaningful context because Joe Biden said, if China threatens our sovereignty, that is the United States sovereignty, we will act to protect our country. And we did. This was a clear reference to the spy balloon, which was circulating over the United States for quite some time. And a few days ago, it was finally shut down when it reached the ocean area, so that when it fell down, it wouldn't make any harm to anyone. Of course, even though the United States accused China of sending that kind of spy balloon, the official reaction of Beijing, or official response of Beijing, was that it was just a sort of research balloon which veered off the course. So you can see that China and the US are playing a hardball these days. Moreover, in relation to that balloon case, the planned visit of Secretary of State Antony Blinken to China was canceled. But again, in the response, China said that no such visit was planned. China had nothing to do with it. It was not on the official agenda. So you can see that the US and China are going back and forth, well, still keeping it kind of diplomatic, but we can see that the tensions are definitely rising. What is also very important to notice in the speech of President Biden is how he framed the current global dynamics. He talked about a battle between autocracies and democracies. Two countries were mentioned in this context. It was, of course, Russia, or not even Russia per se. It was described as Putin's aggression. So Putin was referred to personally. So was personally referred President Xi Jinping, when the President Biden said that no one would actually change places with Xi Jinping. This can be observed, or this can be interpreted as some sort of throwing down the gauntlet to President Xi Jinping. And of course, we can clearly see that the US is closely watching what's happening between Moscow and Beijing. I had the chance to be a co-author of one analysis, which was published by the Harvard International Review, in which we wrote about this connection between Moscow and Beijing and the so-called No Limit Pact, which was signed just 2 or 3 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine actually happened, which suggests that China was very much aware of what was going to happen. And of course, the question is whether China did not really bet on the wrong horse. Probably China followed the belief of Putin himself that the whole operation, not war, as it was described officially by Moscow, this whole operation would last only 3 days. As we know, it was not 3 days. It's already almost 1 year since the invasion of Ukraine. Speaking of the battle between autocracies and democracies, I would like to stress that this is not the first time President Biden is framing global dynamics in such a way. He actually talked about the very same battle between democracy and autocracy almost 1 year ago. It happened during his very meaningful, important visit to Poland, just 1 month after Russian forces attacked Ukraine. In the Royal Castle in Warsaw, Biden had a pretty strong speech, I must say, which I also listened to in full, in which he was stressing that the democratic world has to stand united against autocracies and has to fight with everyone who is trying to diminish the freedom of nations and people. In this context, in the context of the so-called alliance, it's not formally an alliance, but, well, let's be frank, it's a sort of no-limit pact between Russia and China. A particular slogan has circulated, particularly in the Taiwanese social media. Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Actually, quite recently, over a week ago, I had the chance to ask Polish ambassador to the United States, Mr. Marek Magierowski, whether he thinks that Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow is a prophecy. And even though Ambassador Magierowski was very diplomatic, he openly stated that his fear and concern is that, yes, if we do nothing about it, if we do not stop Russia, if we do not win, help Ukraine win the war, Taiwan might be next. Naturally, it is an obvious question to ask. Why would China attack Taiwan now? Taiwan and China have existed since 1949 as in ROC and PRC, so it's over 70 years already. So does 2023 make any difference? What has changed since 1949? So, of course, we have to stress that China has a very different capacity right now to carry out a forceful unification or reunification, as China is saying. However, I also think that we have to take into account a personal context, that is ambitions of President Xi Jinping. And here is where I'm going directly or making a reference directly to the title of my presentation, what the third term of Xi Jinping means to Taiwan and to the United States. Without a doubt, the fact that Xi Jinping was re-elected again for the third term means that he also managed to consolidate power in his own hands in an unprecedented way. Naturally, it's not that Xi Jinping is ruling China single-handedly. He does have a group of people around him, people whom he can trust, and who, as many observers claim, are pretty much yes people or yes men. So the question is whether any of them would be brave enough to stop Xi Jinping and the PLA from taking brutal steps to unification with Taiwan. I know it's a kind of personal perspective. We usually talk about Taiwan in the geopolitical perspective, economic perspective, military perspective, but personally, I would not underestimate the personal ambitions of President Xi Jinping. Some say that he has become the second Mao Zedong or the reincarnation of Mao Zedong. However, I would say a little bit provocatively that he doesn't want to be second to Mao Zedong. He wants to be second to none. So I really wouldn't be surprised if Xi Jinping's ambition was to have the portrait, the famous portrait of Mao Zedong, replaced by his own portrait, which would suggest that it is Xi Jinping who is the one and only, the biggest, the most powerful, and most wonderful leader in the history of the PRC. The question is, how can you leave that kind of legacy? How can you become the #1 leader in China's history? The answer is unification with Taiwan. It's hard to surpass the achievement of Mao Zedong and proclamation of the PRC in 1949, but I'm pretty sure that the so-called reunification would give Xi Jinping an eternal place in the history or in the book of China's history. Xi Jinping, just like many other leaders of the PRC, has been stressing that the so-called reunification of China is a historical inevitability. In his speech in October last year, he was stressing that it is a historic mission and an unshakable commitment of the PRC and particularly the Chinese Communist Party. What is particularly concerning is that he said that China would never promise to renounce the use of force. So indeed, China is still talking about the peaceful reunification, but what we all should be really concerned about is this transformation of narrative, where now China is saying, yes, peaceful reunification, but we still have the so-called nuclear option. I'm not saying nuclear in a literal meaning of this term, but we still have that very extreme option, and we can actually use force to achieve our own goals. And finally, as many others, Xi Jinping has been stressing that pretty much China and Taiwan are destined to be reunified. And since, if you have that kind of narrative, you're talking about something as destiny or inevitability, that leaves no space for negotiations, that pretty much leaves no space for hope that such a dispute can be somehow resolved, not singly or one-sidedly. It is justified to ask whether the Chinese invasion of Taiwan is actually possible. Of course, invasion is one of the options, unless you believe that your destiny, the destiny is written in the stars, then we all probably agree that everything is possible and all options are always on the table. However, it seems that the tensions between China and Taiwan and China and the US in the context of Taiwan has been rising significantly. Less than 2 weeks ago, Air Force General Mike Minihan issued a memo to his officers, and that memo was leaked. At least leaking is the official version that has been talked about. And in that memo, General was claiming that 2025 is the date when we can expect a confrontation, military confrontation between the United States and China. The case of the possible invasion of Taiwan has also been a subject of various reports. For example, less than 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure to analyze and comment in the Polish public radio the report which was issued by CSIS based on war games, 24 scenarios of war games. And the conclusion of this report is that probably China would lose. Let me stress, there are various scenarios analyzed, and there are scenarios which are very pessimistic for Taiwan. However, the main general conclusion is that Taiwan can be defended, provided that US gets involved and gets involved quickly. Time is the essence in this case. Plus, it's very important whether other allies of the United States join the war and defend Taiwan. And here the report was talking mainly about the possible engagement of Japan. As I said, invasion is one of the options, and until that happens, we probably would not be able to predict or say with 100% certainty whether this will be our reality or not. What we can foresee is that, based on the current events, is that China will for sure continue its coercive measures against Taiwan, and will try to keep Taiwan separated or keep Taiwan's participation in international organizations limited. We know very well that Republic of China, Taiwan was excluded for the United Nations back in 1971. But this was not the last step of China, which was taken against Taiwan. And those coercive measures also in international organizations are still there and can still be observed. At the very beginning of my presentation, I promised you I will give you some Central and Eastern European perspective, because the last 2 years actually brought some significant changes in the attitude of some countries of that region. Let me start with Lithuania, which probably we have all heard about. Lithuania has been very open in its support for Taiwan, and it allowed the so-called Taiwanese representative office to be opened in the capital of Lithuania, Vilnius. The thing is that, as you can see, it's not Taipei, this name Taipei, that was used in the name for the office. It was the Taiwanese representative office, whereas Taipei is the standard global practice. The name Taiwanese, using that name, really angered China. And since then, China has applied coercive measures against Lithuania. So we can see that even though opening that office under this name, this particular name, was a political move, the retaliation of China came not just in political dimension, but also in the economic dimension. However, European Union and US came to the rescue. European Union filed a complaint to WTO on behalf of Lithuania. That complaint was backed by the UK and Australia. And moreover, the United States offered a $600 million credit line to Lithuania, to Lithuanian companies which were affected by China's actions. Interesting case is also provided by Czech Republic, and these are very recent events because we've recently had presidential elections in the Czech Republic, and the newly elected president, former general Petr Pavel, already said that he would love to meet President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, and he stressed, he openly stated that he already had a phone call with President Tsai Ing-wen. It's particularly important in the context of what that was actually the second phone call that he had. Can you guess whom he called in the first place? In the first place, his first phone call was made to President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. So you can see the connection. First phone call to Ukraine and the second phone call to Taiwan. It is definitely a sort of reflection of this Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow slogan that I have mentioned earlier in my presentation. We don't have time to get into all the details. I just want to mention that among all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Slovakia has also tightened its relations with Taiwan over the last 2 years. Just like in the case of Czech Republic, many important Slovakian leaders, politicians visited Taiwan and also accepted high-ranking Taiwanese officials back in their country. Poland, my country, is pretty much at the crossroads, I would say. We can indeed observe that Poland has been issuing some gestures toward Taiwan, but I would say that in comparison to Lithuania, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, Poland is still trying to balance between China and Taiwan. That leads me to a question: why all these countries are brave enough to tighten their relations with Taiwan? If I were very idealistic, I would say that these countries know the taste of freedom very well. All these countries were members of the former Soviet bloc under the communist regime. So I guess it's a part of our cultural DNA, us as in the people of Central and Eastern Europe, that we don't like situations when big countries bully smaller neighbors. But as I said, that would be very idealistic. To be very practical and realistic, it's important to notice that all these countries have been pretty much disappointed with the 16+1 format. That is the format of cooperation between China and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. For example, last year, the foreign minister of Poland, Mr. Rau, openly stated in one press conference that Poland is disappointed. He used that word, disappointed, with the 16+1 format, in a way that Poland has expected something more. And this is indeed the case of all the countries I've mentioned here in this slide. There is a second context why these countries are becoming more pro-Taiwanese and kind of distancing themselves from China. Their security depends, and future and prosperity depends on strong military alliance with the United States, which can protect them from Russian influences, or in a more extreme version, Russian invasion. Soviet Union has fallen apart over 30 years ago. However, the Russian threat is still there, and the case of Ukraine is the best proof why Russia is still a neighbor to be afraid of, as long as Russia is not fully democratized. That leads me to a conclusion. What next? As I've already mentioned, invasion is not something given, it's not a destiny, but unfortunately, it is becoming more and more probable. Why would it be 2025, as this US general has suggested? Let us remember that 2024 will be a critical year in both the United States and Taiwan, because in both of these countries, we will have presidential elections. So who knows whether Joe Biden will continue to be the president of the United States. It is not technically impossible that Donald Trump will run again. And who knows what will happen in Taipei, whether it will be still DPP or whether KMT will come back to power. We can guess that China would like it to be KMT, with which it has had much better relations. So I'm guessing this is the logic behind saying that 2025 might be the year of a possible invasion, because China will be waiting to see what will actually happen in the domestic politics of the United States and Taiwan. Let us remember, international politics is always, it's always attached and always stems from internal domestic politics. It can never be analyzed separately without reference to what is actually going on inside those countries. Thank you very much for your attentions. And if there are any questions, I will.
Well, fascinating presentation, and certainly a provocative one. I think there are many people who would say that there are other things short of invasion that China might try. For example, some talk of a blockade or that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, the real question I think most people would ask is, what about the economic damage that would be done to China by such military force against Taiwan? I mean, you point out very, very accurately this relationship between what happened in Ukraine and what happened in Taiwan. And I think one of the big lessons that the Chinese, Xi Jinping, would hopefully have learned is that there's a great deal more solidarity these days than anyone had expected in terms of standing up to aggression like what Russia has done.
Thank you, Richard. You're absolutely right. And I think that Ukraine is in a way some sort of a litmus test for international solidarity among democratic countries, particularly democratic countries, because they are the ones that have been most active. Absolutely. As you've noticed, and as I've been trying to stress in my presentation, invasion is not the only option on the table. We also can talk about maritime blockade, which would be some sort of a laughter of history, because back in 1950s, 60s, and up to mid-1970s, more or less, Taiwan was trying to exercise military blockade of the continental China, which was meant to cut China off from international trade. So now if China does it to Taiwan, it would be some sort of reverse of those actions. And another question is, or another possibility is salami slicing. Perhaps China would not go for the full invasion in one go, but perhaps would start with those tiny, tiny islands which are lying very close to the shore of China and which are still controlled by the ROC. So absolutely, there is a whole range of options and possibilities, out of which invasion is, of course, the most extreme one.
Mm-hmm. So Jim asks a very, sensible question. Just, do you really think, or you mentioned that CSIS study? I mean, what is the likelihood that the U.S. would actually come to Taiwan's defense in the face of a full invasion? The Taiwan Relations Act is really not very clear on this. And is it your opinion? Is it, in your opinion, possible that the people of the U.S. and Congress will not want to go to war over Taiwan?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a very good question. And I'm afraid that all I can say is that it will definitely be a matter of political calculations. We can talk about a whole bunch of legislations, not just TRA, but we have Taipei Act, Taiwan Travel Act, Taiwan Assurance Act, whatever you can imagine, which in a way prepares the United States legally to defend Taiwan at some point. But in the end of the day, yes, indeed, it will be a matter of political calculation whether the US wants to apply all those legal frameworks and wants to come to the rescue for Taiwan. The same case with Japan. Japan, technically speaking, can say, no, we don't allow the United States to use its military bases in Okinawa, for example. Or the political calculation in Tokyo can be such that Japan will join the United States in case of open war with China. I'm afraid it's really hard to determine what will happen until that really happens. However, it seems to me that Taiwan is one of the few cases which is in a way uniting Republicans and Democrats. In the US Congress, it seems that both of these parties are concerned about the future of Taiwan. However, the final decision will be of purely political nature.
Okay. Can you offer some examples of coercive acts by China on countries like Lithuania, the Czech Republic, and Poland, and whether or not they've resonated with the local populations?
Sure. Thank you very much. So Lithuania is the best case so far. Czech Republic is now a litmus test. Poland, as I said, is still balancing and still hasn't been really punished by China yet. In Lithuania, those coercive actions, they include limiting official relations between Vilnius and Beijing to the charge d'affaires level. So the ambassadors were called off. That means that China-Lithuania import-export pretty much doesn't exist anymore. That means that companies, European companies, for example, German companies, have something to do with Lithuania, which, for example, import some elements, some products from Lithuania and then export them to China, had some problems with the custom processes. So you can see that those coercive actions were not only directed at Lithuania per se, but Chinese officials have noticed that in order to make it more efficient and successful, they have to target everyone or every company which has something to do with Lithuania, and such pressure has been exercised on German companies so far. When it comes to social reactions, I was in Lithuania in late 2021, when already this whole turmoil about opening the Taiwanese representative office existed. And I had the chance to talk to normal people, from university professors to taxi drivers. And I must say, I was very surprised to find out that almost all of them were aware of this turmoil and were very much pro-Taiwanese. I mean, I'm not sure whether all of them were capable of showing where Taiwan lies on the map, but it was they were aware about this China-Taiwan issue, and that China is trying to put some pressure on their country, which is a big thing. When I talk to people in Poland, they usually mix up Taiwan with Thailand. So there is still much to be done when it comes to the social awareness and, you know, knowledge, basic knowledge about differences between Taiwan and China.
Yeah, actually, that would happen not infrequently in the United States as well. It's interesting, on the Lithuania front. In fact, Germany did try to exert pressure on Lithuania to make a compromise, and which shows that, you know, this solidarity in the EU is nothing to be taken for granted. I think there's a great deal more solidarity in the EU vis-a-vis Ukraine than anyone expected, but I don't think it would be replicated with Taiwan. I wanted to go back to this issue of what the US reaction might be. Is there now a good argument that the US should shift from strategic ambiguity to clarity on the issue of whether or not we would support China militarily?
I'm sorry, Richard, could you please repeat
Sure.
the question?
Should the U.S. has had this policy of strategic ambiguity. That is, we won't make it clear one way or the other what we would do if there were an invasion. Should we now get rid of that? Should we now be clear about which way we would go?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question, and actually, I've had several discussions quite recently with my colleagues in various universities and places around the world about that. And our conclusion is that even though I guess particularly Taiwanese people would feel much better and would be much more optimistic, knowing that yes, the United States for sure will come to the rescue and will defend Taiwan in a military way, it seems that strategic ambiguity gives the United States, gives Washington more space to maneuver, and it keeps China guessing. Keeping the other side guessing is one of the main elements of those political games. It's a kind of psychological game and psychological warfare. So I remember when President Joe Biden, I think at least two times, if not three times, when he was asked during some sort of interviews or press conferences, would the United States defend Taiwan militarily? He said yes. And when he was asked for clarifications, he said yes. You know, he suggested that yes, American troops would be sent to Taiwan. And afterwards, the White House was in a way clarifying that no, Washington still recognizes one China policy and six assurances and so on and so forth. You might say, and I came across such comments and analysis that, well, Joe Biden doesn't really know what he's saying, and the White House has to clarify those things afterwards. But think about it. Isn't that purposeful behavior of Joe Biden? Maybe it was indeed coordinated with the White House, saying on one hand, yes, we will defend Taiwan, and one day afterwards, no, we are, faithful to one China policy. We have nothing to do with Taiwan. It is also a psychological game. It is a form of psychological warfare. So I think that it is better to leave China guessing and not taking US decisions for granted.
Yeah, actually, suggests that perhaps it's in China's interest as well, because China really does need Taiwan to keep its economy running. Without the Taiwanese chips, especially TSMC, has been proven, China cannot produce its own high-end chips. It would be the decision to invade or even to blockade would be a real roll of the dice, as you illustrated in your, but one that would pretty much foreclose China's hopes of becoming the #1 economy in the world, at least in the medium term, I would think.
Absolutely, and it illustrates very well that we are not really talking about the Cold War 2.0 situation. I mean, there are definitely some similarities between the original Cold War and what is going on right now, but the world is much better connected these days than it was before the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So we can clearly see that whatever happens in the Taiwan Strait will have direct implications for countries such as Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, which would probably 30, 40 years ago never really think, in the same categories. But these days, we are all very closely connected, and it will impact all of us. I usually give to my students or my friends a very, practical example. If something goes wrong in the Taiwan Strait, you will be waiting 2, 3, 4 years for your new mobile phone on fridge or dishwasher because of the semiconductor issue. So this is something we will probably all experience in our own lives.
I mean, one of the theories about Xi Jinping's what he may or may not do going forward is sort of dependent on the economy. So, for example, if the Chinese economy is in very difficult circumstances right now, the growth has pretty much stopped, although it may be coming back in the post-COVID era. And one theory was that if the economy slows down, if they have a large youth unemployment problem, that in order to distract the public from the two pillars of legitimacy of the Communist Party of China are economic growth and nationalism. And if you get rid of one, the economic growth, then nationalism has to replace it. So does that figure in your calculations about Xi as well? Or do you think it's just his image and history? Sorry.
Absolutely. I think that the so-called cultural nationalism that the Han Chinese nationalism that we observe in China these days, based on those ideas of national rejuvenation and reunification, this is the ideological motivation for all those actions. And when we talk about distracting public, people, citizens from the real economic problems, let me give you another example from China's international relations. I wanted to tell you one example from China-India relations, and please give me 1 minute. I will show you the connection, why I'm talking about it also in relation to Taiwan. In 1962, there was a border war, 1-month border war between China and India. China attacked India without any warning. It was a big shock and surprise to Indians. There is a long list of reasons why China wanted to and did attack India, because it wanted to show India its place, because India was too provocative, because China really wanted some territorial gains, and so on and so forth. But there is also a theory that actually Mao Zedong wanted to distract people in China, their attention from the real internal turmoil. And what is the best way to distract people from their real life problems? By finding a common enemy, external enemy. That works in 99% of cases. And if you look at the timing, the China-India border war happened almost exactly at the time of the Cuban crisis. Coincident? Maybe not. Maybe China was waiting for such a moment when the rest of the world, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, will be distracted themselves and will be focusing on their own issues. And then China will be able to quickly step in and give India a lesson. So yes, I guess it is fair, at least to have such a theory or an assumption that Taiwan can be used as a distraction.
Well, both, yes. Or Ukraine can be a distraction to allow China to exert more force on Taiwan. One of the interesting things is Andy has asked. One of the interesting elements of this is the way not just U.S. but all Western companies withdrew from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But most, Western companies were not as reliant on Russia as they are on China. To have all of these large companies pull their production out of China, not just what they're selling, but what they buy from there, would be, I mean, Apple, for instance, would not have iPhones if they withdrew from China. How will that impact on the calculations of U.S. and Western countries as to whether or not they will have the support of their corporate, the corporations that are so important to them?
Thank you for this question. I actually wanted to mention it at some point, but now I have a very good occasion to do so. Indeed, big Western countries, which have had much closer economic relations with China, will find it more difficult to be openly pro-Taiwanese or to come to the rescue or in some way, for example, put sanctions on China. This is another possible scenario if China wants to mess up with Taiwan. It's a paradox that smaller countries, you might think, well, small countries like Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, they must be really scared of China. It is France and Germany which can do something, which can say something and then say no to China. No, it's actually the other way around. France, Germany, and other big Western countries have more to lose if something goes wrong in their relations with China. Countries such as Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and others look at their trade relationship with China. All of them have a trade deficit with China. For example, Poland's export to China is 10 times smaller than import from China to Poland. It's 10 times. So you can see that it's a huge imbalance, which is a big matter of concern for the Polish government. But what I'm trying to say that such countries, such small or middle-sized countries, actually have the paradox, more space to maneuver. And maybe tightening relations with Taiwan and developing economic relations with Taiwan is a chance for them. And for example, we have several MOUs between Poland and Taiwan and Lithuania and Taiwan, and if I'm not mistaken, also Slovakia and Taiwan regarding semiconductors and developing research and maybe at some point also production of semiconductors. I know it's a very long way to go, and it's more about optimism rather than reality at this point. However, as I always say, all options are on the table.
Yeah, well, I think that's the wisest way to look at the situation in the Strait, and I also think 25 as the base year makes a lot of sense because of, as you pointed out, the elections. It does seem possible that the political situation in Taiwan might shift enough to keep the things from getting worse. It's always been my impression that the big issue between China and Taiwan was whether or not Taiwan declared independence. That everything short of that was something that they could deal with, but that the red line, if you will, is a declaration of independence, and the DPP has been very careful not to do. There are elements of the DPP, obviously, but and local elections recently have shown that there's I think the Taiwanese people are kind of very aware of this as well. So, do you think that China would invade or take some harsh action against Taiwan short of the Taiwanese government making some obvious step towards independence?
Indeed, declaring independence, which in the case of, because it's a kind of tricky term. ROC is pretty much independent already, right? Yeah. Independent in a way that it's a de facto independent country.
So they no longer, but to say that we no longer believe in one China, that we are now, we're going our own.
Exactly. Exactly. So we don't use the name ROC anymore.
Right.
We become Taiwan, right,
Taiwan,
with a
right.
totally different identity.
Right.
So indeed, I think that this would be a point of no return, and China would be forced to attack simply in order to save face. However, I'm afraid that it doesn't have to come to that. China needs a much smaller pretext to attack China if it really plans to attack Taiwan, if it really wants to attack Taiwan, because it's one of the options, right? But if these are indeed the calculations of Beijing, I'm afraid that a much smaller, probably manipulated or purposefully created, I don't know, skirmish, or I don't know if Taiwan shuts down another Chinese spying balloon, because it's also important to notice that that spying balloon, which was circulating a few days ago, is not the only case of spy balloons. These balloons were noticed over the last few years in various places of the world, including Hawaii, including Alaska, including Guam. So who knows, if Taiwan shuts down a Chinese spying balloon, maybe this will be enough for China to attack. I'm afraid that these kind of small pretexts will be enough.
Mm-hmm. But on a side note, Jeff says that the recent RAND study shows that estimates that China would lose 20 to 35% of its GDP, while the U.S. would lose about 5 to 10% of GDP should a battle of sanctions and embargo go forward. But by the way, another participant asked if anybody knows what happened to this general who wrote this letter, or this memo to his staff, which was really quite bizarre. I mean, for those of us who remember Dr. Strangelove, this guy was pretty much like the general who went. Anyway, so does anybody know what's happened to what's happened to this general? Was he at all? Was there any discipline or anything against him? Do you know, by any chance?
I don't know, but let me stress it once again. We have to ask ourselves the question whether this memo was really leaked or whether it was purposefully leaked, because I've also heard that kind of voices.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's actually a term for it. It's a pleak, the public leak of information. All right, let's see what else we have. I think we're coming to the end. Anyway, this has been fascinating, and you know, as someone who spent half of my career in Eastern Europe and a lot of it on China, this is one of the rare circumstances where I can combine both of my experiences. But this was a terrific presentation. Lots of our participants have complimented you in the chat room. And I want to really thank you for taking the time to join us. And the next time you come to Honolulu, we'll take you to lunch.
That's a nice incentive. It's always about food, right?
Always about, at least for the China seminar, it always was about food. So.
But seriously, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a sheer pleasure. And I hope to see you in person soon in Honolulu.
Okay. Great.